Okay, sorry. So, the national government was growing in relation to the states at this point in time. Well, why did the era of good feelings end? Well, there's a number of answers for this. We had an economic recession in the year 1819. There was a lot of debate over this national bank and the McCulloch v. Maryland decision, which said that the Bank of the United States was constitutional. Remember, that was an issue of strict constructionism versus loose construction that was fought at. But there was nothing better that caused the end of the era of good feelings except for the Missouri Compromise. And this was started because there was an attempt to ban the expansion of slavery into the Missouri Territory. This was known as the Talmadge Amendment. And Congress ended up making an agreement to allow the expansion of slavery into Missouri as long as Maine would be added as a free state, preserving the balance of power between the North and the South in the United States Senate, each of them having 11 states, 11 slave and 11 free. This creates some tension between the North and the South, and sectionalism rises. But there's another thing that causes the end of the era of good feelings, and this would be the election of 1824. 4 candidates ran for president, all as Democratic Republicans in the year 1824. The 3 leading candidates were John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. Jackson won the popular vote, but he did not get a majority of votes. He only had a plurality of votes in the Electoral College, which means it goes to the House of Representatives. He claims that Henry Clay made a corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams in order to allow John Quincy Adams to become president of the United States. This causes a rift in the Democratic-Republican Party, and then we will see the rise of the Democratic Party and the Nationalist Republican Party, which is kind of short-lived too, because around 8 years later we'll see the rise of a new party that replaces the Nationalist Republican, known as the Whig Party. So, John Quincy Adams becomes president of the United States. He believes in the expansion of federal government in relation to the states. A lot of people didn't think that at the time. A lot of Southerners had a lot of distrust for John Quincy Adams, particularly after he recognized countries like Haiti that was formed through a slave revolt, and the Toussaint Louverture, who was a former slave, now leader of the country, and agreed to send an ambassador to the Pan-American Conference. But there were a number of things that kind of caused Southerners to distrust John Quincy Adams. But really, the biggest things that caused him to lose in the 1828 election was a change in the electorate. 2 things began to happen in the 1820s. Number one, the parties decided to get away from a caucus system of choosing a president and moving to a national nominating convention, which gave more people the ability to be able to have say in who they chose as the nominee for the parties. The second thing that began to happen in many southern states particularly was the end of property ownership requirements to vote. And this is known as universal white manhood suffrage, the ending the property requirements. This allows a whole lot of new people who weren't voting before to be able to vote, and many of these people were poorer and less wealthy, smaller farmers, maybe even like sharecroppers, and they tended to support Andrew Jackson, who was able to win the presidency in the 1828 election, becoming president in 1829. There's a lot of things about Jackson's presidency that are important. When he becomes president, he basically puts a whole lot of party supporters in positions of government. This is known as the spoils system, replacing people who were previously there. He also supports the Indian Removal Act, which is an act passed by Congress, which moved the Indians out west. He vetoes a number of attempts by Congress to expand national roads, and one of these most famously was the Maysville Road veto, where he rejected a road which was going to go directly to the hometown of Henry Clay, and this leads many of the members of the Nationalist Republican Party and Democratic Party to call him King Veto, because he tends to veto pieces of legislation. He only vetoed approximately 12 pieces of legislation, but only 2 pieces of legislation had been vetoed before in all of the previous presidents. He saw the veto as a way to be able to politically control what was happening, whereas most presidents previously saw this as something where the president would only determine whether or not it is constitutionally okay to pass a law. So he kind of changes the way veto is perceived. He does not pass more or have more vetoes than any other president. FDR had something like 500 vetoes during his presidency. So it's nowhere near that, but he does kind of change the view of what the veto was. And obviously, he gets involved in some other controversial things like the Tariff Abominations crisis. Now, the Tariff of Abominations was a very high tariff. So the tariff began to rise after the American System Tariff of 1816 to try to protect American businesses. It rose to 25% from 15% in 28, and then in 32, it rises to its highest level, which is almost 45%. Which that means like every good coming in from another country was 45% more expensive. So this made goods more expensive that were manufactured in the United States, but you didn't necessarily see a rise in how much people were being paid for raw materials. So Southerners were negatively affected by tariffs, while Northerners, although they had to pay more for goods that protected many of their jobs, were not as negatively affected. So many Southern states rejected this, particularly South Carolina, and the Vice President of the United States, who was from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, even wrote a doctrine of nullification that said states don't have to obey laws that they don't like. This leads Jackson to ask Congress to pass a force bill which would allow him or give him authority to go down there basically with gunpoint and force South Carolinians to pay this tariff. But before that happens, Henry Clay pops in and he's able to get them to pass a compromise tariff, which lowers the tariff from 45% back down to 25%, which was the 1828 rise that kind of started this whole anti-tariff issue in the first place. The other big thing, obviously, was his veto of the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States. The veto was actually forced by Henry Clay because Andrew Jackson was resigned to basically allowing the bank to just die out, but Henry Clay tried to make an election issue in the 1832 election, and so Henry Clay vetoes it, and then he says, all right, since the bank is still open, and it has to be open for the next 2 years, I'm actually going to take all the money out of the bank, actually 4 years, I'm going to take all the money in the bank, split it into these separate, smaller, state-run pet banks, and that will allow more everyday average farmers and to be able to get money, but it actually led to a rise in over-speculation of land, and when prices did not rise in the West, banks lost a lot of money. We call these wildcat banks. In addition to that, plus the idea that he only started to, he made a memo that went out that said he would only accept gold currency for any land bought by the United States. This is known as specie circular. Those things, combined with some economic times that were not strong, leads to the 1837 economic depression, one of the worst in our nation's history. But of course, he was no longer the president at that time. He could just blame it all on Martin Van Buren. The Whig Party, though, formed in the 1832 election to support Henry Clay, and they formed as a foil to the Democrats at this time. And because of this economic depression in 1837, the Whigs are actually able to win an election in 1840 with everyone's famous war hero, William Henry Harrison, who then died 1 month into his presidency, allowing John Tyler to become president, who was the only president in our nation's history to get kicked out of his own political party because he really was a Democrat, but he had run as a Whig to help William Henry Harrison get some Southern votes. And so John Tyler gets kicked out, and in 1844 they're going to elect a new president, which will be James K. Polk. We'll get to him later. During this time, we're seeing the first American Industrial Revolution. This is caused by the rise of industrialized factories and the influence of Samuel Slater, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, and the growth of the southern industry, as well as Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts and its influence on the northern industry, Robert Fulton's steamboats, the Erie Canal and the growth of canals, mostly paid for by states, but some are partially funded through federal government in the American system. The rise of the train, the Baltimore-Ohio Railroad was the first train line in the east. It still wasn't expanding out west yet. We don't get the Transcontinental Railroad until after the Civil War is actually completed. Then we also see like Cyrus McCormick, whose mechanical reaper is going to expand wheat production in the north and the Midwest. John Deere, whose steel plow allows us to be able to dig through the western prairie land, which allows for further expansion west. Charles Goodyear, whose vulcanized rubber allows people to be able to, easier travel west as well as move goods quicker within the United States on these new roads. Isaac Singer and Elias Howe, who helped expand the industry, the textile industry in the United States through their sewing machine. All of these people contributed in some form or fashion to the first industrial revolution in our history. But the first industrial revolution had a huge effect of expanding the amount of people who were brought into the country to work many of these factory jobs, and particularly people from North and Western Europe, Germany, Ireland, and France, where we saw many of these immigrants coming in. These were the old immigrants. Now, Irish were treated very poorly because of their Catholic faith, and you saw groups like the Know Nothing Party form, which were nativist groups that tried to discriminate against immigrants. But other immigrants were not treated as bad as we will later see with the second wave of immigration in the United States during the Gilded Age, which were the new immigrants from South and Western Europe, many who were either Catholic or Jewish. Other effects of this were obviously separate spheres of influence of women now moving out of the household and working in these factories. There were many people who fought against this, those who believed women belonged in the home, and this viewpoint of the cult of domesticity and the influence of women on the home was being challenged. And there was a push for women to play a large role in teaching kids, about American values and nationalism. This is known as the Republican motherhood movement. But the effects of the Industrial Revolution expand even just beyond the effects on women and immigrants. It spans in terms of the income gap between the rich and the poor, and the United States, once again, starting to become more of an industrial power and needing more supplies as we move west. It has a whole wide-ranging series of effects. Okay, let's talk about manifest destiny, which was a term by John L. Sullivan that basically said that God has given us from sea to shining sea to control, so we didn't feel bad about killing people who were in our way. And the first real expansion during this time period into further Western territory were Americans who moved into Texas in the 1820s. But then Texas, at that point in time, Tejanos, which was controlled by Mexico, banned slavery. Many of these people were slave owners. When they refused to obey Mexican laws, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna sent in troops to basically put down this rebellion of these Americans living in their territory. The first place they fought was the Alamo. That became the battle cry of the War for Texas Independence, which ended with the Battle of San Jacinto River, in which Sam Houston defeated Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And now you had an independent territory that is signed over by Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna to these Americans who were living in that territory. And they wanted to become part of the United States of America, but we wanted to allow them to because we knew this would be a huge slave territory added to the United States, and Northern senators didn't want that to happen. And so it's not until James K. Polk gets elected president in 1844. In 1845, one of his campaign promises was that we would add Texas, but he also wanted to add Oregon to the United States because he had two main focuses. He wanted to expand west with Texas, and he wanted to expand west by taking Oregon. In fact, he said with Oregon, and all the people had moved out west of the Oregon Trail, and it was a combined territory between the United States and Great Britain, he said, we're going to get to the 54th 40 parallel, or we will fight Great Britain for it. But he did not get the 54th parallel, and he did not have to fight, because the Oregon Treaty, which is really cleverly named, basically split the Oregon Territory on the 49th parallel between Great Britain and France. We got some, they got others. I hear Portland's great. So, once that territory is added, and then we decide, and we add Texas and we add Oregon, we should be good to go. There should be no more fighting over expansion of territory until, of course, 1848, when we decide that we're not happy with the Mexican territory we've already taken, we should take more, and this is the Mexican War. Now, it mainly starts because there's a border dispute between whether we own the land all the way to the Rio Grande River or whether we own the land to the Nueces River. Well, we said that we owned it up to the Rio Grande, and the Mexicans said, no, you don't. And then there were some Americans Mexicans who were killed on what was officially Mexican territory, but we said American blood's been shed on American soil in order to have this war, because the real reason this war is fought is in order to gain California and manifest destiny and expansion. And so we do go to war with Mexico, and we do defeat them. And in the middle of the war, because we're now expanding west into what is likely to be slave territories, there was an attempt by a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot to try to prevent the spread of slavery into this new territory, which did not go over well amongst Southern senators and Southern congressmen. It led to almost a division between the United States at that point in time, and eventually they had to settle what they would do with this new territory, something called the Compromise of 1850. But once we gained this territory with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, then we had to make those final decisions. Okay? So the Mexican War is the beginning of this tension, real tight tension between the North and the South. And although we did create the Compromise of 1850, which I'll cover in my next lecture, that didn't really solve the problem long run. Okay, the other thing that comes out of this is the rise of some anti-slavery parties, particularly those who wanted to stop the expansion of slavery into the Texas territory. This would be the Free Soil Party. But there had actually been a party that was an anti-slavery party that had run previously, known as the Liberty Party. It's the first abolitionist party in our nation's history, and I'll touch on that later. Just so you know, Zachary Taylor was the president elected in 1848, so he was the president when officially Texas becomes part of the U.S. And then he dies in office after a year or two. He's the only two Whig presidents were Zachary Taylor and William Henry Harrison. Both of them died quickly. Apparently it's not a good thing to be elected a Whig president. And then everyone's favorite president, Millard Fillmore, took over from there. And then in 1852, the Democrats once again win, and that is Franklin Pierce. But we also see the rise around that time of a new party known as the Republican Party. And just so you know, to finish up expansion, in 1853, under Franklin Pierce, we decided that we would purchase one more piece of land that would close out the continental United States, and this would be the Gadsden Purchase. Probably the most important purchase in United States history. Okay. The other thing that was happening during this time was a religious revival known as the Second Great Awakening. And this was a fervent religious revivals. We call them the burnt over districts because people were being inflamed with the Holy Spirit, and there were these massive revivals going on in many parts of the country. This happened with the Presbyterians and in Charles Finney. Peter Cartwright was a famous Methodist minister who would hold many of these things. But you also saw the rise of some other religious groups and sects, like the Mormons, who led by Joseph Smith, and then later Brigham Young moved out west to Utah to establish this as kind of a religious utopia. I don't want to call it a utopia, but a religious asylum for them. And then we also see utopian communities like Brook Farm, the Oneida movement, and I didn't put that on there, and then of course the Shaker movement, which they did not believe that in procreation, which is why we don't have a lot of Shakers anymore. Other movements that occurred during this time that were influenced by the Second Great Awakening would be the education reform, the temperance movement, the women's rights movement, and most importantly would be the abolitionist movement. Horace Mann started many of these education reforms in Massachusetts, and it's in 1857 that Massachusetts becomes a state that requires education for all students. And the goals of the education reform movement were in large part training people to be factory workers, as well as trying to assimilate students who were immigrants coming into the country, into American culture. And similarly, another assimilation movement in some ways was the temperance movement, which wanted to limit alcohol, and who was drinking the most alcohol? Usually Catholics who came into the United States. And so it is a response to the changing demographics at that time. And Neal Dow in Maine becomes the first state to ban alcohol. But there were about 15 states that had banned alcohol in the United States by the year 1857. So even even, this is way before Prohibition in the 1920s. This was popular in some states. But then, of course, you also see the rise of the women's rights movement and the Seneca Falls Convention with with Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. But before I get to that, I forgot to talk about the prison reform movement under Dorothea Dix, which was also inspired the Second Great Awakening. And so we eventually would get to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, which was spawned on by women's involvement in many political things during the 1830s into the 1840s. The first female school for girls, was Troy Female Seminary. The first female college for girls was Mount Holyoke College. And then the first co-educational institution was Oberlin College. All these are forming in the 1830s to 1840s. And then we see women starting to play a much larger role in the abolitionist movement at this time. And as they start to do that, and they're actually left out of many of these meetings, they decide they should have their own meeting. This is the Seneca Falls Convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, where they passed the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. But they also talk a lot about issues like abolitionism, in prison reform, and education that women were concerned with at the time. But the largest thing, right, that women were involved in, one of the largest social movements, was the abolitionist movement, which was growing through the 1830s into the 1840s, and then starts to get a very large, not overwhelming, but a much larger size by the 1850s. All the way back in the 1817s, something called the American Colonization Society was created, which wasn't really an abolitionist movement, but they were Northerners who wanted free blacks to be able to send back to Africa. And in 1822, they actually purchased an entire country in Africa to send free blacks back. This was known as Liberia, and it was led by people like James Monroe. The capital of Liberia, by the way, even today is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. So that wouldn't necessarily be, but you can consider this kind of the beginning of some of these like abolitionists, or at least let's help these black people by getting them out of our country, sadly, at that time. But there were a lot of these apologists that were dominant of the age. George Fitzhugh, who wrote something called Cannibals All, was one of the leading apologists who argued that the abolitionists and the Northerners who claimed that blacks were being poorly treated in the South are treating their immigrants and people in, like up in the North even worse than they were treating in the South. And people like John C. Calhoun were even making these religious arguments that slavery was a positive good, and constitutional arguments that it's a violation of the Fifth Amendment to even take away someone's slave, which was property. But abolitionism started to rise. In a large part, so we started to see things like Nat Turner's Rebellion, which actually had a negative effect on slaves in the South. This was a violent rebellion in Southern Virginia in 1831 that led to the rise in slave codes in Southerners. But in the same year, in 1831, the Nat Turner's Rebellion happened, we also saw the first issuing of The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison, who becomes one of the most vocal critics of slavery and leader of the abolitionist movement, as well as Frederick Douglass, who begins to go around the country and speak out against slavery. And so abolitionism starts to rise to the point that we even have a political party, as I mentioned before, the Liberty Party, that fights against slavery. And then we even see that movement that wanted to stop the expansion of slavery further and further west. But because of this rise of abolitionist literature, there were attempts in Congress to even keep congressmen from hearing from the abolitionists. These were known as gag rules, which prevented abolitionist literature from showing up in the mailboxes of members of the House in the United States Senate. Now, the popular idea around slavery was not really abolition, sadly. It was mostly, let's stop it from spreading. And this is the foundation that the Free Soil Party based their party on, and eventually the Republican Party, which is founded officially in 1854. It starts to be formed after, I think I said 52, 54, during the Kansas-Nebraska crisis in Bleeding Kansas. And we see the Republican Party nominate their first candidate for president in 1856. They lose, but in their second major national election, they obviously win with a dude named Abraham Lincoln. Now, the abolitionist movement begins to splinter, in part because of those who are pro-women's rights and those who are against women's rights, those who just want to stop the expansion of it, and those who want to stop it altogether, and then those who are violently abolitionist and those who think that that's not the best route. Obviously, the very clear example of someone who's a violent abolitionist would be John Brown. And John Brown's raid in 1858 is clearly one of the meteors of the Civil War, as Southern states form the Confederate Army in response to what happened. That's it.